London 1600. How human waste was managed before modern sewers. In the year 1600, London was one of the most populous and dynamic cities in the Western world. With a population estimated between 250,000 and 300,000 inhabitants, the English capital had grown extraordinarily over the previous century, driven by trade, imperial expansion, and a constant influx of people arriving from the English countryside and from other European nations. It was a living, noisy, fetid, and fascinating city, where wealth and misery coexisted within a matter of meters. Craftsmen, merchants, nobles, beggars, actors, physicians, and thieves shared the same narrow streets, the same open-air markets, and in many cases the same heavy, odor-laden air that no modern inhabitant could tolerate for more than a few minutes. To understand how that city functioned, one must descend into its darkest foundations, into what rarely appears in the paintings of the era or in its most celebrated literary records, yet which determined, in an absolutely decisive manner, the health, the survival, and the daily organization of an entire population. One must speak about human waste, about sewage, about the refuse that each of those 300,000 bodies produced every day and that had to go somewhere. The London of 1600 possessed no sewage system in the sense we attach to that term today. There were no underground pipes carrying waste away from the city, no treatment facilities, no organized and centralized public infrastructure capable of handling the colossal volume of refuse that a metropolis of that size generated daily. What existed was a collection of practices, some inherited from the Middle Ages, others developed on an improvised basis as the city grew, that attempted to deal with a problem whose scale was greater than any solution available at the time. To understand this system, or rather this absence of system, it is first necessary to understand the physical structure of the city, because it is from that structure that all sanitary or anti-sanitary practices made sense. London was a city built in layers. The streets were narrow, many of them no more than 2 or 3 meters wide, lined by timber-framed and plaster houses that leaned toward one another on ever more overhanging upper floors, so that the occupants of the top stories on opposite sides of a street could, in some cases, reach out and shake hands through their windows. The surface of most streets was made of irregular stone, compacted earth, or simple mud, depending on the neighborhood and the season. Down the center of most streets ran a kind of shallow gutter or channel, called a kennel, through which flowed a mixture of rainwater, domestic refuse, urine, and every sort of residue thrown from windows or swept out of doorways. This central channel was not a planned drainage system. It was simply the inevitable result of street topography and gravity, an urban stream of dubious content flowing toward the Thames or some nearby tributary. The question of solid waste, of human excrement, was resolved in a manner that seems primitive today, but that, in the context of the era, represented the best that could be offered. The great majority of London residences possessed a private latrine, known as a privy, a booth or compartment with a seat opening beneath which lay a pit dug into the ground. This pit was what the English called a cesspit or cesspool, a hole of varying dimensions, sometimes brick-lined on the sides to prevent collapse, but generally left open at the base so that the liquid portion of the waste could be absorbed by the soil over time. The solid portion accumulated gradually over weeks and months until the pit was full and required emptying. This emptying process was carried out by a category of workers whose English name, Gong farmers, carried a somber irony, since Gong was a medieval term for latrine. Gong farmers were the professionals responsible for the most insalubrious and essential work in the city. They operated exclusively at night, a legal requirement that existed for reasons both of public decency and health, though the understanding of public health at the time was quite different from our own. The prevailing theory of disease in the London of 1600 was still heavily influenced by the concept of miasmas, the idea that corrupted airs and fetid odors were themselves the cause of disease, not merely symptoms of contamination. There was therefore a logic behind the prohibition on working with cesspit waste during the day. It was necessary to minimize the population's exposure to the smell that inevitably accompanied the process. Gong farmers arrived with their carts, wooden buckets, and digging tools, sometimes literally descending into the pits to remove the accumulated material, then carting everything out of the city to designated sites known as lay stalls, a primitive form of waste disposal ground. Some of this material had commercial value, as human feces, like animal dung, could be sold as fertilizer to farmers in the countryside surrounding London, creating a chain of nutrient redistribution that, though no one at the time understood it in those terms, functioned as a rudimentary form of recycling. The work of the Gong farmers was paid, and paid well in comparison with many other manual occupations, precisely because it was so unpleasant and so necessary. There are documented cases of workers who died drowned or asphyxiated inside the pits, overcome by the gases that accumulated in those confined spaces, particularly methane and hydrogen sulfide, though these gases were not known by their chemical composition at the time. The system of pits and gong farmers was, however, permanently under pressure in a city growing so rapidly. The problem was not only the volume of waste produced, but the density at which the population was concentrated. In neighbourhoods such as Southwark, Cheapside, or the areas around the Port of London, the proximity between the cesspits and water sources was terrifying. London had no centralised and reliable water supply system in 1600, though initiatives toward this end were under development. The majority of the population depended on wells, rivers and streams that cut through the city, many of which were already seriously contaminated. The Fleet, the Walbrook and other smaller watercourses that fed into the Thames had been transformed over the centuries into open sewers, receiving not only rainwater but also cesspit overflows, slaughterhouse waste, and the effluents of tanners, dyers and all other industries that depended on water and discharged their waste wherever they could. The Thames itself was the epicenter of this problem, and paradoxically, the main solution the city had for it. The river was simultaneously London's most important communication route, a water source for a significant portion of the population, and the final recipient of much of its waste. Water carriers plied the Thames, transporting buckets and barrels of water that were sold to households without access to their own well or to one of the few existing public fountains. The water these men drew from the Thames was the same water that received further downstream the city's sewage and refuse. An awareness that some relationship existed between water quality and disease existed in a vague and intuitive form among some physicians and intellectuals of the time, but it was far from a clear understanding or from having practical implications for most of the population. The question of odour was omnipresent and constituted in itself an important dimension of the urban London experience at the beginning of the 17th century. The inhabitants of London not only tolerated smells that would today be considered intolerable, they associated them directly with questions of health in ways that, though based on mistaken premises, reflected a genuine attempt to understand the environment in which they lived. The miasmatic theory, which had dominated European medical thinking since Greco-Roman antiquity, and which would only be refuted in the 19th century with the development of germ theory, attributed to the emanations of decomposing matter the capacity to cause disease. This meant that physicians and London municipal authorities understood that something harmful existed in the odours of waste, though they did not know exactly what. The preventive measures taken by the authorities, such as regulating the nighttime work of Gong farmers, prohibiting the disposal of waste in certain areas, and attempting to keep streets clean through the scavengers, municipal workers tasked with sweeping and collecting rubbish from public thoroughfares, were all motivated in part by the belief that eliminating foul smell was eliminating disease. The scavengers, unlike the Gong farmers, operated during the day and were responsible for street cleaning in a broader sense. They collected horse dung, food scraps, household rubbish discarded on the pavements, and tried to keep the central gutters of the streets clear. In some parishes, this service was reasonably organised. In others, especially the poorest and most densely populated, it was practically non-existent or carried out so inadequately as to make little difference. The parish was the basic administrative unit of London in 1600 for many local services, and there was enormous variation in the quality of waste management from one parish to another. Wealthy neighbourhoods, home to prosperous merchants, successful lawyers, and members of the nobility who preferred city life, tended to have better-built pits, Gong farmers hired more regularly, and streets maintained in less deplorable conditions. Poor neighborhoods crammed with recent immigrants, laborers, low-income craftsmen, and the marginalized of every description lived in conditions that today would be classified as a permanent sanitary emergency. There was also a practice that, though officially prohibited and socially condemned, was widely prevalent: the direct disposal of waste into the streets. The phrase associated with this practice, though often cited in exaggerated or romanticized form, reflects a reality documented in municipal records of the era. Occupants of the upper floors of houses, especially those without easy access to a latrine or whose pits were full, simply emptied the contents of their chamber pots out the window, with or without a prior warning shouted to passers-by. Fines were prescribed for this practice, and parish records show that people were indeed fined for it, but enforcement was irregular and the practice persisted. Urban life in London in 1600 required pedestrians to pay attention not only to what lay on the ground, but also to what might fall from above. The question of animal waste complicated the picture still further. London was a city where working animals and slaughter animals coexisted with the human population at a proximity that would be unimaginable today. Horses were the principal form of individual and collective transport, and a city of London's size housed tens of thousands of them. Each horse produced a considerable quantity of dung per day, and the total accumulated in the streets, even with the efforts of the scavengers, was enormous. Slaughterhouses operated within the city limits, and the waste from these operations, blood, offal, bones, fat, ended up in some manner in the streets or the rivers. There were tanners who used human and animal urine in the leather curing process, creating a peculiar demand for this waste, and leading to the existence of urine collectors known as piss-pot men, who moved through the streets collecting the contents of household chamber pots to sell to the tanneries. There were dyers, brewers, fishmongers, and a variety of other trades, whose operations contributed effluents of diverse nature to the urban environment. The sum of all this created an ecosystem of waste of a complexity and magnitude that no mechanism available at the time could manage in any truly effective way. The comparison with other civilizations and historical periods was something that intellectuals and travelers of the era occasionally made, and the result of this comparison was not necessarily favorable to the London of 1600. Ancient Rome, which had impressed the ancient Mediterranean world with its cloaca maxima and with a system of aqueducts and sewers that transported clean water into the city and waste out of it, had established a standard of sanitary engineering that medieval and modern Europe had not yet managed to recover in its full extent. The Roman baths, with their public latrines supplied with running water, stood in stark contrast to the conditions prevailing in London 16 centuries later. This does not mean that Rome was a perfectly hygienic city, far from it, but an awareness of the possibility of more efficient systems existed on the cultural horizon of Renaissance Europe and had not yet translated into comparable urban infrastructure. The consequences for public health were devastating and constant. London was a city with an extremely high mortality rate, and historians who have studied the mortality records of the era have identified a clear correlation between population density, sanitary conditions, and the frequency of disease outbreaks. Dysentery, caused by bacterial contamination of water and food, was endemic, constantly affecting a portion of the population and causing death especially among children and the elderly. Epidemic typhus, transmitted by lice but associated with overcrowding and precarious living conditions, appeared regularly in the records. Typhoid fever, transmitted through water and food contaminated by feces, was probably responsible for a significant proportion of deaths, though it was not identified as a distinct clinical entity in the medicine of the time. And most dramatically, the city lived under the permanent shadow of bubonic plague, which had ravaged Europe repeatedly since the 14th century and which would continue to appear in London until the great outbreak of 1665. The relationship between sanitary conditions and the proliferation of the rats and fleas that transmitted plague was naturally unknown at the time, but the empirical association between poverty, overcrowding, insalubrity, and plague mortality was observable and caused considerable social and political anxiety. London's municipal authorities were not passive in the face of these problems, though their responses were limited by the knowledge available and by the institutional resources of the era. The Corporation of London, the governing body of the city, promulgated regulations on waste disposal, on the location of slaughterhouses and tanneries, and on the obligation of residents to maintain the pavement in front of their homes in minimally acceptable condition. There were periodic inspections of street conditions and cesspits. There were penalties for those who violated the rules, but the capacity to enforce these regulations was limited, and in moments of crisis, such as during plague epidemics, the authorities resorted to more drastic and symbolic measures, such as burning aromatic herbs in the streets to purify the air, which were far more theatrical than effective. The question of clean water was closely linked to the question of sanitation, and the first efforts to improve London's water supply were already underway at the beginning of the 17th century. The New River Project, completed in 1613, was an extraordinary initiative that transported water from relatively clean sources in Hertfordshire to a reservoir in North London by means of a canal approximately 60 kilometres long. This project, conceived and realised by the entrepreneur Hugh Middleton, represented a significant advance in the water supply for part of the London population, but initially benefited only those who could afford the connection, and even with the new river, the general sanitary situation of the city remained far from satisfactory for more than 2 centuries. The separation of clean water supply from waste disposal, which is the foundation of any effective modern sanitation system, was still very far from being achieved. The impact of the sanitary situation on social classes was profoundly unequal, but did not follow a simple line of untouched rich and afflicted poor. The London elites of 1600 lived in conditions that were better than those of the working population, it is true, but still conditions that by modern standards would be considered troublingly insanitary. The great mansions of nobles and prosperous merchants had larger pits, emptied more regularly, and were set further back from the filthy streets, but still depended on the same fundamental system. When the plague arrived, it did not spare wealthy neighbourhoods with the same consistency with which it fell upon the poorest, though social mobility, the capacity to leave the city and retreat to country estates, was an option available to the wealthy that saved many lives. The poor could not flee, could not pay for better constructed cesspits, could not acquire the aromatic herbs that physicians prescribed to purify the household air, and died in disproportionately greater numbers during every epidemic outbreak. The sensory experience of living in London in 1600 was, therefore, radically different from anything that most people in the contemporary Western world can imagine. The sense of smell was permanently assailed by a mixture of odours that included horse dung in the streets, the smell of the latrines, the characteristic odour of the River Thames on warm days, the smoke of wood and coal from kitchens and hearths, the smell of live and dead animals, and a variety of other industrial and organic aromas. The Londoners of 1600 did not necessarily feel that they lived in abnormal conditions, because that was the normality they knew, but there existed among them a clear awareness that certain conditions were worse than others, that certain parts of the city smelled more than others, and that there were periods of the year, especially summer, when the problem grew notably worse. Summer was the most feared season from a sanitary standpoint. The heat accelerated the decomposition of organic waste in the cesspits, the streets, and the river, intensifying the odours, and in a manner then not understood, but which we today understand perfectly, also accelerating the proliferation of the bacteria and parasites that caused disease. Death tolls rose regularly in the warmer months of the year, and those who could afford to leave the city during the summer did so frequently. The royal court, when there were no urgent political reasons keeping it in London, tended to move to royal residences outside the capital during the summer months, a pattern that reflected both a preference for the countryside and an awareness that the city was a more dangerous place in that season. The relationship between the city and the River Thames deserves particular attention because it exemplifies in paradigmatic fashion the contradictions and paradoxes of the London sanitary situation at the beginning of the 17th century. The Thames was the heart of London, the reason for the city's existence at that particular location, the artery by which goods arrived from all over the world and which connected London to the sea and to the rest of the globe. It was also one of the city's most severely degraded natural resources, already completely transformed. In its stretches near London Bridge, into something that more closely resembled an open sewer than a natural river. Hundreds of tributary streams discharged into it what they collected from the city's streets and grounds. The cesspits near its banks overflowed directly into it, and the boats transporting goods and passengers contributed their own waste. And yet from the Thames came fish consumed by the population. From it water was drawn, sold and drunk. And on its banks operated commercial establishments of every kind. The river was simultaneously essential and contaminated, a source of life and a receptacle of death. The Thames possessed a capacity for self-purification that, though limited, helped to mitigate to some degree the level of contamination in its stretches further from the city. The action of the tides, which in the Thames was and remains very significant, contributed to the circulation of water and the dilution of waste, but also, perversely, meant that refuse carried away by the ebbing tide was brought back by the rising tide, creating an oscillating effect that left a good portion of the waste trapped in the urban stretch of the river for long periods. The Londoners of this period probably had no clear understanding of this phenomenon, but the most experienced among the Thames fishermen and boatmen certainly knew through empirical observation that certain conditions of the river, at certain times of year and in certain states of tide, were worse than at others. The cultural and social dimension of this sanitary reality cannot be ignored either. The way a society deals with its waste reveals much about its values, its hierarchies and its organization. In the London of 1600, the work of the Gong farmers was indispensable and recognized as such, but the workers who performed it were treated with the kind of ambivalence that societies typically reserve for those who perform essential but stigmatized functions. They lived and worked on the margins of social respectability, even though their earnings were comparatively reasonable. The private latrine, the privy, was a marker of status. Having a well-built covered pit, distant from the house and emptied regularly, was a sign of relative prosperity. The poorest shared communal latrines or simply resorted to even less formalized methods. Privacy in the act of defecation was a luxury that a large part of the population of a city like London could not afford. Attempts to find technological solutions to the sanitation problem in cities like London developed over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, but slowly and in a fragmented manner. The idea of connecting household cesspits to underground channels that would drain them away was technically feasible, and in some wealthier neighborhoods there were primitive precursors of this concept, essentially open ditches or brick culverts that carried cesspit overflows to nearby watercourses. But this type of solution merely transferred the problem from one place to another, depositing in the river what had previously been contained in the soil. It was precisely this approach, generalized and poorly planned, that would transform the Thames in the following decades and centuries into a still more compromised sewer than it already was in 1600. The irony of London's sanitary history is that attempts to solve the problem without an adequate understanding of its causes and without a systemic vision of what would be required contributed to aggravating it until the situation reached a point of crisis that would finally force a response equal to the challenge. That point of crisis would arrive more than 2 centuries later, in the summer of 1858, in an episode that became known as the Great Stink, when the exceptional heat of the London summer transformed the Thames, by then already the recipient of decades of ever-increasing sewage from an explosively growing population, into a source of emanation so unbearable that the members of Parliament themselves, whose buildings stood on the river's banks, were forced to suspend their sittings. Only then, faced with a crisis that physically and publicly affected the holders of political power, was funding approved for the construction of a modern and comprehensive sewage system for London, designed by the engineer Joseph Bazalgette. That system, built in the 1860s and 1870s, with its kilometers of underground intercepting sewers that collected waste and transported it beyond the city limits before discharging it into the river, represented the solution that London had needed for centuries and whose delayed arrival had cost countless lives. But the Great Stink and Bazalgette belonged to a future far beyond the horizon of 1600. In the London of the early 17th century, that city which served as backdrop for the plays of Shakespeare, the sermons of John Donne, the experiments of Francis Bacon, and the daily lives of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people whose names have not come down to us, the sanitary reality was what it was. A combination of improvised solutions, inherited practices, partially enforced regulations, and a tacit coexistence with conditions that caused suffering and death on a scale that we would today consider unacceptable. The pits were emptied when they could be. The streets were swept when there was someone to sweep them. The river received what had nowhere else to go, and people continued arriving in the city, drawn by the opportunities it offered, dying from it at rates that required constant immigration just to maintain a stable population. The London of 1600 was a city that functioned in spite of its sanitary conditions, not because of them. It was a city that had developed over centuries a capacity to absorb and adapt to the consequences of its own filth, albeit at a human cost that only became visible in its full extent when modern historians began to examine with care the mortality records, the court proceedings, the municipal documents and the accounts of the chroniclers of the era. What those documents reveal is a community that understood the problem intuitively, that tried to solve it with the means at its disposal, and that lived with the consequences of its limitations with a resilience that was not choice but necessity. To understand the London of 1600 in its sanitary dimension is to understand something fundamental about the history of cities and the history of public health, that the infrastructure we today consider basic and obvious, the clean water that flows from the tap, the sewage that disappears at the flush, the rubbish that is collected regularly, is the result of centuries of painful learning, of crises that forced change, of engineers and sanitarians who had to convince governments and populations that investing in the invisibility of pipes and pits was worth as much as investing in churches, palaces, or city walls. The London of 1600 reminds us that these achievements were neither inevitable nor automatic, and that between the city it was and the city it would become lay a distance measured not only in centuries, but in countless human lives, spent under the weight of conditions that could have been different had the knowledge and the political will arrived sooner.